So my name is Khemasuri. I've written it up there because it's one of the funny ones. And I'm here this evening as a sort of a different speaker, as it is June, and June is Buddhist Action Month. And Christine knows how to say it. And the Buddhist Action Month is international, and it's not just our Sangha, it's all kinds of Sanghas right around the world, bringing attention to the fact that we can actually make a difference in the world through our practice, through practicing the Dharma. And I'm here because I belong to a very small group in the Sangha called the Earth Metta Sangha, which meets once a month. And we plan things, and we listen to talks, and we just talk about having a bigger perspective on our practice and what that means in the world. So I'm infiltrating a series on the Paramitars. The current theme is called The Way to the Beyond for the Benefit of All, and we're looking at the Bodhisattva path, the ideal of enlightenment for the sake of all beings. We are discovering how the Bodhisattva ideal can be lived out here and now. The talks in this theme outline the way that we grow and develop beyond our habits, beyond our limitations, so that we not only benefit ourselves, but in doing so benefit all beings and the world we live in as well. Our Buddhist practice, in fact, is not ours. It's bigger than we are, bigger than our small individual lives. And we're also dipping into a very famous text called the Bodhicharyavatara, written by a man called Shantideva in the 8th century. It's one of the most popular accounts of the Buddhist spiritual path, and as it was written in medieval India, in a time and a culture which is very unlike our own, it needs a bit of unpacking, and this is what they were doing in this series of Sangha evenings. We're looking at what the Paramitars mean in our own lives. And another way of looking at the Bodhicharyavatara could be as a manual on how to become a trainee Bodhisattva. In many ways, anyone who takes up the Buddhist path seriously is this, a trainee Bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattva path has six stages, and sometimes it's 10. We have the 10 here, and we're up to ethics. We're just at the beginning of this path of practice, and we're talking about ethics. So last week, if you were here, Vidanya talked about truthful communication and told us a very cautionary tale about a man called Donald Crowhurst. And this was a story about the dislocation of the truth and the invention of a fiction which led to his total isolation, fear of discovery, mental breakdown, guilt and eventual complete disappearance. Nobody knows quite what happened to him, and it was a very strong tale. The week before, Bodhinaga talked about the basis of our ethical practice, which is mental vigilance, being able to notice our thoughts and know what drives our speech and our actions. It was also about continuity of purpose, which is keeping our spiritual direction and the precepts in mind as we go about our lives. Without these key skills, we cannot make choices. We can't make choices about how we respond, and we can't change and we can't grow without making those choices. So tonight, the talk is called Ethics and an Interconnected World, and I'm going to ask two kinds of questions. So the first one is, how can it be that when we practice ethics, we do it for the sake of all beings? What does that mean? And if we understood that, what would that mean as a trainee Bodhisattva? So to start with, I want to introduce you with two fundamental concepts that the Buddha taught throughout his life. They intertwine and underpin the truth of interconnection, the practice of ethics and the precepts, and can help us understand the outcomes of our actions, and to do this without falling off. And so I'm going to talk about something Buddha called Pratita Samappada, and I'm also going to talk about karma, which is a word you're going to be more familiar with. So when the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and became enlightened, he realised the truth of the interconnection of all phenomena. He knew that the world around us, whether we know about it or not, was connected, not separate, and that humans were no exception. The Buddha knew this not as a theory, but as a direct experience, a realisation of what was called in the Buddha's time the way things are, which actually is a very good description of it, but it's puzzled me for years. How can it be just called the way things are? You will find out, hopefully. The truth of interconnection, the Buddha called Pratita Samappada, and it's also called the law of conditionality. This spiritual insight had nothing to do with any kind of conceptual construction. It was a particular way of experiencing the world, in which the Buddha's time, again, was simply known as the way things are. It is the core teaching of the Buddha. He spent the subsequent 55 years of his life teaching nothing else but this truth. And he taught it in lots of different ways. He taught it in stories. He taught it through myths. He taught it through symbols. He taught it through concepts. The practical teaching of meditation and ethics and the formulations of the path, like the paramitas, are all ways of bringing about the conditions that we need to see this truth. All his teachings flowed from this desire to communicate this way things are, this insight into reality, this path to this understanding and this particular way of experiencing the world. The present Dalai Lama calls Pratita Samappada the Buddha's slogan, but it's not dependent on us, it's not dependent on human beings. It's more like a natural law operative on all levels of existence, from physical matter to culture and consciousness. The most famous expression of Pratita Samappada is, and it's written on that piece of wood over there, so it's a constant reminder, it's in this room with us all the time. When this is, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that becomes not. From the ceasing of this, that ceases. So it sounds quite simple, doesn't it? It sounds like quite a simple way of looking at things. It looks like a simple sentence, but it is difficult to comprehend in all its richness and implications. Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant for much of his life, and a bit of a fall guy in the Buddhist scriptures, he's always getting it wrong. He says to the Buddha at one point, it is wonderful, Lord. It is marvellous how profound this Pratita Samappada is, how deep it appears, and yet it appears to me as clear as clear. And the Buddha responds, do not say this, Andana. He's always saying this to Andana. Do not say this, Andana. Do not say this. This Pratita Samappada is profound and appears profound. It is through not understanding, not penetrating, that this generation has become like a tangled ball of string. So we're in a mess because we don't understand it. We get things wrong because we don't understand the truth, the reality of Pratita Samappada. For the purposes of this talk, I want to make a distinction between the way we usually see the world and the way that conditionality tells it's in. And this is incredibly simplified, okay? So, in our Western world, the popular view of the world is causal, okay? It's a historical problem we have, and I would personally like to blame it on either Descartes or Newton. I'm not quite sure who, but somebody around that time. It's all their fault. We think about the world, how the world functions in very simplistic terms. There is a cause, there is effect, and that is the end of the story. So in a straightforward causal understanding, you can chop down a tree and you can process it to make paper for newspapers. This is all that happens. Actions take place in isolation, but it is not so to my mind. The law of conditionality says that the behaviour of everything in the world is a complex network of causes and conditions. So chopping down a tree also destroys the habitat of living beings. Making paper uses chemicals which have an effect on the environment. It uses water, which decreases the flow in a river, by which agriculture is affected. It produces waste products, and then the paper is produced and it's written on. And who knows what effect those words will have when they are read by other people, and how the world will be changed by them. So it's very intricate. That is really simplistic, but it's a very intricate. All around us are the flow of conditions, change, adaptation. Everything is in flux, nothing is finished, nothing is static. The fundamental teaching of Pratitya Samutpada, the teaching of conditionality, means we are never separate from the world around us. This is the truth of interconnection. So I like to look at my muesli sometimes and work out the connections that I have through what's in the bowl in front of me. And there's all the grains and the people who grew them around the world. There's the nuts and the forest that they came from. There are people who picked them. There are people who packaged them. There are people who sent them around the world. There are people who collected them from the ports. The people who took them into factories where they mixed them up for me. And then they got to the shop and I went and got them. And I just think, if you sometimes just look at your dinner, you know that you're interconnected in this world. You could not survive on your own without those connections. We're deeply interconnected on all fronts. Because we're interconnected with others and the world around us, our thoughts, words and actions will always have an effect. In fact, we cannot act in isolation ever. All our actions have consequences. Everything we do will have an effect and may have several effects. So in summary, the law of conditionality is a universal and natural law, like the law of gravity. It means we're interconnected with others and the world around us. Our thoughts, speech and actions will always have an effect on the world. We cannot but have an effect. Our actions will always have consequences for both ourselves, others and the world we live in. And this is very good. This is very good. It means we can make a difference to the world around us. We can make a difference to the people around us, and we can change ourselves. And the world around us is one that seriously needs our love, compassion, awareness, and ethical sensibility. And now I'm going to talk about karma. So this word here. Karma is the law of Pratitya Samutpada, the law of conditionality and interconnection in the realm of human action. Simply put, karma is about the actions and the very real consequences of our actions. Actions here are not only about our physical actions, but our speech and thoughts. Our thoughts will always have an effect. The first time somebody told me that, I thought, get real. How can something I think so internally have an effect? And it took me a long time to understand that was probably so. And the way we even look at somebody will have an effect. And it will have an effect dependent on what we are thinking about them. Just try it out tomorrow. Just bear that in mind and see what happens. See what you can notice. Our actions create our own and the world's future all the time. In the very oldest Buddhist scriptures, the Dhammapada, it starts with these verses. I think it's very important that this very ancient book starts with this. Our life is shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Suffering follows an evil thought as the wheels of a cart follow the oxen that draw it. Second verse. Our life is shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Joy follows a pure thought like a shadow that never leaves. Our life is shaped by our mind. Our mind precedes all actions and speech. We and the world about us will become what we think. This is a description of pratita samappada in the realm of human action, and brings into focus in my mind what Bodhinaga was talking about a couple of weeks ago. To know our thoughts means that we can make choices about how we act. This is really important. The law of karma also states that the outcome of our action will be dependent on the state of mind which initiates that action. The intention behind our action is of vital importance. If we act from greed, hatred, or delusion, the result will be suffering for us and the world around us. If we act from generosity, compassion, and wisdom, the result will be positive for us and the world around us. It is important that we act ethically as individuals, that our actions come from positive intentions, because those consequences of our actions are all important, and we can't escape it. We may never know what the consequences of our actions are, and in some ways we don't need to even need to think about the consequences of our actions. If we act with good intentions, we can rely on the effect being beneficial. We can trust the law of karma. We do need to act as skillfully and as conscientiously as we are able. We are all learning. We are trainee bodhisattvas. We haven't got it right yet, but we are learning. We can act in the knowledge that we're not isolated or separate from the world around us. The consequences of our actions are borne by others and by the planet as a whole, as well as ourselves. We do not know what effect our actions will have, but we can be sure that they will have an effect. If we know this, if we really take this on, then we may as well act as positively and as skillfully as we can manage, as often as we can manage. And for those of us who wish to be Buddhists, or even trainee bodhisattvas, to do this as fully as we can is a bit of a no-brainer. It underpins our practice. So what does this mean in our day-to-day lives? Ethics can be practiced at a personal level and at a collective level. For example, the second precept, refraining from taking the not given, could be practiced on a personal level. For example, not taking a second helping of cake when there are others in the room who haven't had it yet. But what about when we calculate the resources that we use and find, as is typical for an average Western lifestyle, that it would take 2.5 planets for everybody to live the way that we do? We use so much resources in the West that not everybody can live like this. So, what does this mean for what we live, how we live? What does it mean to live a sustainable life, a simple life on this planet? And in this case, we need to think about the relationship with the global human community and our planet. It's our home. It's the only one we've got. On a personal level, you might decide to challenge a racist remark in the post office queue. Well, by challenging it or deciding not to do so, you are influencing the social landscape within which all our daily lives take place, our collective space. I used to live in it was a place which had a population of about 1,000. It was actually a town, but it was the smallest town I've ever met. And I was in the baker's one day, and quite near the baker's was a cafe which was run partially by people who got learning difficulties. And they were often very visible, and they were often sometimes very noisy too, in ways that were unpredictable. And some new people had moved into the town, and they were in the baker's, and they were complaining about the people who ran the cafe. They were a bit surprised that they were so prevalent and visible within this community. And they were saying some very unpleasant things about them. And I was just in the baker's and somebody said, these people are our brothers and sisters and they're our children and they belong to this community. And you're new and you haven't got used to it yet. And everybody in the baker's went, you're quite right. You're quite right. You just have to get used to this. This is what this place is like. And I was so proud. I was so proud of my community that they would just stick up for people and be kind and just put someone right. And it was just lovely. It was just lovely to people. But it took that bravery, that risk of somebody saying, actually, you're the one that's got it wrong. Yeah? So it's good. In 1971, Sangharakshita, so Sangharakshita is the man who founded the Triratna order and community. He gave a talk called Evolution or Extinction, a Buddhist View of Current World Problems. He wasn't known for his snappy titles. If you're interested in following this up, this talk is in the book back. I think it's one of the last 2 chapters, or perhaps the last chapter, in a book that you'll find in the bookshop called What is the Sangha? So in this very early talk of his, he talks about the problems the world faces. He talks about the economic problems, political, commercial, social, racial, and I would like to add 45 years later, ecological, population pressures, movements of people, and perhaps most pressing, climate change. This world is in deep trouble. And Sangharakshita talks in this talk about promoting change in terms of a spiritual path. He talks about spiritual development and the spiritual community as an essential foundation for change. He says that we can have strong reactions to the cruelties and injustices of our world, but often, when this initial reaction has exhausted itself, we can feel drained and powerless. The problems of the world seem too big for us to do anything about, so we try and forget them. We close down, and our lives become small and more limited. Sangharakshita says in this talk, we are sorry that others suffer, but at least we can enjoy our own lives. He's a bit pokey at times, Sangharakshita, and he also goes on to say this. However, my view is that such an attitude of withdrawal from public concerns into purely personal ones is one that is not worthy of a human being. It represents an abdication of responsibility. Doesn't mince his words, does he? And here is where the trainee bodhisattva remembers the law of conditionality. The trainee bodhisattva remembers that all our actions have consequences and that we can always be agents for positive change. With the power of ethical action behind us, we can make a difference. So I'm going to turn to Shantideva and the Bodhicharya Vitara now. Shantideva says, strive at first to meditate on the sameness of yourself and others. In joy and sorrow we are all equal. Thus be a guardian of all as of yourself. So he's talking here about not considering ourselves as separate with unique qualities or special feelings. This is the purpose of the metta-bhavana practice. He says, strive at first to meditate. This is important. We recognise that all beings desire happiness and wish to be free of suffering. In really understanding this, acknowledging this, and feeling this, we can begin to act our lives for the benefit of all. Shantideva also describes in the Bodhicharya Vitara the desire to act for the benefit of others in really heroic terms. These are lovely verses. I do really like them. For all those ailing in this world, until their sickness has been healed, may I myself become for them the doctor, the nurse, the medicine itself. Raining down a flood of food and drink, May I dispel the ills of thirst and famine. And in the ages marked by scarcity and want, may I myself appear as drink and sustenance. May I become an inexhaustible treasure for those who are poor and destitute. May I turn into all things they could need and be placed close beside them. It's one of my favourite lines. May I turn into all things they could need and be placed close beside them. To be placed close beside them, it softens my heart somehow. The main point here is not to think of ourselves as limited beings with limited resources. There is always something we can do. I have a friend who says, small acts of kindness save lives. I was teaching meditation on a very big Buddha field retreat a few years ago, and we were talking about small acts of kindness. We were teaching the Metabhavya, talking about small acts of kindness. And there was a man on the edge of the tent, and he just started crying. He just cried from the noise. And then when we'd finished, Kula Ditcher is a friend of mine who was teaching with me. He went and talked to the man, and he said he'd been in his 30s, and he was just at the end of his tether, and he didn't know what to do. And he went out for a walk down one day, and he was convinced he was going to kill himself. And he was walking across a bridge, and somebody smiled at him, and he was seen as a human being. And he knew that his life was worthwhile. And he just said it just touched that so deeply, just being seen. Even the way that you look at someone or greet them, you don't know what effect that's going to have on their lives, but it will have an effect. It might only be tiny, it might not make any difference at all, but there might be an instance like this man. It might save his life. You don't know. So Shantideva invites us to see a bigger picture beyond our own small personal lives and act on our knowledge and empathy with the suffering of others. We can develop our ethical sensibility, and then we can act on it. To do this, we have to take responsibility for the world around us. There is no good in thinking that someone else needs to sort it out. The world around us is the outcome of our individual and collective actions. We can enhance the outcome of our ethical actions by joining or creating a spiritual community. We can promote change with others because when we come together, we are stronger than we are on our own. And we do not have to do this on our own. It's really important to know that. One of the most important aspects of the spiritual community for me is that it's in an ideal position to critique the society we live in. An ideal position to challenge cultural assumptions and habitual ways of living. The spiritual community values kindness, doing no harm, being easy to support, not taking up too much of the resources of this planet. Virtues that are not always easy to find in our neoliberal society. We can also join with other communities to promote spiritual values. For example, peace groups, anti-globalisation networks, organisations that protect the environment and promote social justice. I've been a proud member of Amnesty for many, many years and will continue to support them in their work. I can't go out into these places and make a difference, but somebody can, and I will support those people. There are many good outfits working towards the health and well-being of the world and its inhabitants, but do remember, take your Buddhist values and principles with you. You do not have to leave them at home and become someone else. Remember that your foundation of ethics is something very valuable to offer the world. So all we can do is act as ethically as we can manage. We can place our trust in the process of conditionality and the karmic outcome of our actions, although we may never exactly know what will happen as a result. In the 1971 talk I was referring to, Sangharakshita, the founder of Triratna, also says, "It does not matter how humble a level we are operating at or how undramatic our work may be. If enough earthworms burrow away under the foundations of even the most substantial building, the soil will begin to loosen, it starts to crumble away, the foundations subside, and the whole building is liable to crack and collapse. Likewise, however powerful the existing order may seem, it is not invulnerable to the undermining influence of enough individuals working directly or indirectly in cooperation." The trainee bodhisattva is a radical being. It's radical to know who you are and be able to stand your ground and speak your mind. It's radical to challenge the culture we live in without turning away or resorting to hatred or blame. The spiritual community of trainee bodhisattvas is a radical community. It's based on the ethics of compassion and wisdom. It's a community which comes together based on the values of friendship, simplicity, and non-craving. We have to remember and honour the fact that we have a distinctive and relevant alternative ways of looking at the world. The spiritual community has the ability to challenge cultural assumptions through spreading the Dharma. In the last section of the Bodhicharyavatara, Shantideva expresses his deep desire for the welfare of others in this moving verse dedicating his life. As long as space abides, and as long as the world abides, so long may I abide, destroying the suffering of the world. This is an expression of the sublime path of Buddhist practice, one that we'd all take part in as trainee bodhisattvas. As trainee bodhisattvas, we can act with integrity, decisiveness, and with as much kindness, generosity, and clarity as we can manage. The law of conditionality means we are completely interconnected, and our ethical actions will have positive consequences. We might as well act according to our Buddhist ideals and practices, be ethical, be prepared to speak out, take risks, and trust the process of conditionality. And remember, we do not have to do this on our own. By acting in this way, we give cosmic significance to our day-to-day experience. As trainee bodhisattvas, we are no longer powerless, and we can live passionately, courageously, and joyfully. Thank you.